effectively the same principles, but in what we're hoping is a more clear, precise, and results-oriented way. So that's kind of the high level. Next slide. Before we dig into the details, and I do want to just sort of put a caveat. Usually this presentation has been about an hour, so I tried to cram it down to 20 minutes. So if there's anything that you're confused about halfway through, I'm happy to go into more detail in Q&A, but just know there's a lot of information we're trying to get through here. We did want to highlight we've been at this effort for just about a year on the dot so far. We've had a handful of community meetings and a handful of planning commission hearings to date that have gotten our proposal to where it is today. I want to be very clear, we don't have a finite proposal. We are still working on it. We're doing, this summer, we were taking some time to do some data crunching to refine some of various aspects of our proposal, and I'll highlight which aspects those are as we're in the weeds. But nothing's set in stone, so we are here truly in a relaying of where we are and hearing your thoughts about the proposal. Next slide. All right, so first, taking a look at why we want to eliminate tantamount to demolition as our first step. We're seeking through this process to remove the tantamount to demolition process, and that has proven to be ineffective, failed to achieve its initial policy goals, lacks clarity, and increases uncertainty in the process. And this is really uncertainty and a lack of clarity for everyone, both for people planning projects, remodeling their homes, or developers, as well as from community members who are trying to understand what the rules and expectations are. Simply put, our conclusion, as well as the conclusion of our Planning Commission, is that it doesn't work. The Planning Commission has agreed with us on this, and they've directed us to proceed with a legislative effort that would get rid of it and replace it with something that they feel works better. So based on the months of community outreach, we've revisited the replacement policy and really took a step back to look at what are our goals, what are our policy objectives. And we've narrowed it down to 5 key goals that are driving our policy development. These are the 5 goals, and these have been based on community input as well as input from various public planning commission hearings. So we want to incentivize smaller units, which are inherently more affordable. Right now, there's no process or planning code control in place that limits the size of dwelling units. We want to incentivize increased density where the existing zoning allows. An example of this would be in the RH2 zoning district. This is our 2-family zoning district. We are hoping to develop a policy so that folks are incentivized to build the 2 units that are allowed rather than a large single-family home. However, property owners wouldn't be precluded from building a single-family home. They would just be required to build a smaller single-family home if they didn't want to have to go before the Planning Commission. Third, we want to promote proportionality between units so that when density is added into a building, whether it's that 2nd unit or that 3rd unit in an RH3 district, those units will function as real, legitimate housing stock rather than just guest quarters of a large single-family home. Fourth, when a project triggers a Planning Commission hearing, we want to set expectations very clearly that there will be an even higher bar for design, requiring a materials board. This is not an unusual requirement in other jurisdictions. When you have a project of a certain size, triggers Planning Commission, there's this extra level of design review scrutiny, so we want to bring those expectations to the forefront. And last but certainly not least, we want to develop clear regulations that every interested party can understand in a 5-minute conversation. All right, so on to what we have. Goals can be lofty, but it's what we're shooting for here. Based on these goals, we've developed a new process called a large home authorization. I'll now get into the details of the proposal. And this proposal, as Rose introduced, relies on floor area ratio, and I'll explain a bit what that is, as the metric for triggering when do you go to a Planning Commission hearing, vice have just a staff level review. So floor area ratio, I want to be very clear on what we're talking about here. So this graphic explains the concept. If those 4 squares on the bottom are your property, a floor area ratio of 1 could be achieved by developing on a quarter of the lot at 4 floors, or you could develop 1 floor on the entire lot. So it's basically a 1-to-1 ratio of your lot area to your housing, the amount of square feet in your house. So that's FAR. It's a very, the reason we've selected this is, although we are getting a little wonky here, this is a wonky technical proposal. This is amending the planning code and our regulations, so we're trying to break it down so that people are understanding of it. But FAR is a very common residential development tool in other jurisdictions. We don't want to be reinventing the wheel entirely here. It already exists in the planning code, and it enables contextuality among different parts of town. So if you're in a part of town that has really big lots, it enables the homes to be a bit bigger. If you're in parts of town that have really small lots, or even within a neighborhood that maybe has normally big houses, but there are a few really small lots right around the corner, it inherently reduces the size of the buildings that will be allowed there without going for a planning commission hearing. So it kind of allows homes to scale with the size of the lots. And this was, moving to FAR was the result of feedback that we got through several planning commission hearings where we initially started with a flat square footage similar to what Corona Heights monster home legislation is using right now. And the feedback we got was that folks didn't want a one-size-fits-all for different neighborhoods. And so this was our way of giving very clear regulations so people know up front what their rules will be, but it's very much based on the lot context. Details of the new process here. So the replacement proposal would apply to both to residential zoning districts, residential house zoning districts. It would apply to all alterations and demolitions. So basically any project is subject to it in the residential neighborhoods. And we'll go into the exact numbers, but if your project is over the FAR, you have to go to the planning commission. If your project is under the FAR, you get to proceed with a staff level review. As part of this effort, we would be eliminating two hearing exemptions that currently exist. Right now, the current rules say that if your building is unsound, and this is an economic measure, not a structure, not a seismic safety issue, it's an economic analysis that's done on your home. If your building is unsound in the single-family home districts, you can be exempt from a planning commission hearing. And we always call it pricing out. If your single-family home is over a certain value, you too get to be exempt from a planning commission hearing. And so as part of this proposal, we're getting rid of that for a variety of different reasons. There's certainly an equity piece of telling folks who have really expensive homes that they don't have to go through an onerous process, but people who live in less expensive neighborhoods in San Francisco do. And it's not really getting to the issue of what we feel good regulation should be, and that is a set of regulations that apply equally across town, regardless of the valuation of your property. Oh, and I think very importantly on this, what we want to be very clear about is this process would not alter current environmental review process. It would not alter current historic preservation review process, and it would not alter design review process, and it would not alter one's ability to file a discretionary review. All of those functions remain status quo. The only difference is instead of being tantamount to demolition, triggering a planning commission hearing, instead this floor area ratio number is what would trigger a planning commission hearing. That is the only change. So a project that's below the threshold, a neighbor could still file a DR and end up before the planning commission. Next slide. All right, so here's where we get into the nuts and bolts of this, and I know this is a lot of numbers on the slide, but I'll try to make this as simple as possible, and we can do follow-up questions later if need be. But basically our proposal is the orange chart at the top here. So our proposal is that if you are based on your zoning districts, there are 4 zoning districts in the RH zoning of San Francisco. RH1D, these are our single-family detached homes. These are neighborhoods like Ingleside Terraces, St. Francis Woods, Sea Cliff, some portions of Pacific Heights, Presidio Heights, those neighborhoods where you have side yards. In those neighborhoods, your FAR would be 1.4. If you are over 1.4 to 1, your project would automatically have to go to the Planning Commission for an approval. If your project came in at an FAR of 1.3, you'd get to start at a staff level review. Again, still undergoing preservation, still undergoing design review, still notifying neighbors, still opportunity for DR. And then similarly applies as you work down the zoning districts. So the RH1, we're saying slightly smaller at 1.2. In the RH2 and RH3, these function a little differently because we're doing it on a per unit basis. So in the RH2 district, if you were to build a single family home in an RH2 district, you would have 0.9 to 1. So you would be constrained here. So 0.9 to 1 is on a typical San Francisco lot of 2,500 square feet, just for example's sake, would be 2,250 square feet. That would be your threshold. If you are building a single family home bigger than that, you have to go and say your piece to the Planning Commission of why your project should be approved. However, if you come in and say, okay, I'll build 2 units on my 2-unit zoned property, then you get to build up to 1.8 to 1 FAR on your lot, which would be a total of 4,500, basically 2,250 a piece, so 2 flats, for example, would be allowed. Same principle in RH3, but we've made the numbers still slightly smaller since there's a higher density. So we would start with 0.7 to 1 if you wanted to build a single family home. That equates to 1,750 square feet. 2 units, you would be able to build basically 2 flats at 1,750, and then 3 units, 3 times 1,750. What we've done on this is, because we don't want to be so overly prescriptive that we mandate that people build 2 exact flats if they're building 2 units, we want folks to have a little bit of flexibility on this. We've put a floor in, and we've said if you're going to build 2 units, you have to have at least a minimum one of those units be 1,000 square feet, so we get to that proportionality goal that we mentioned on the previous slide.
This is good.
We'll follow up with some questions next, yeah. So just to be very clear, this is not a maximum buildable area. This is a trigger for process. This is all about dictating your process and setting clear expectations. Yeah, great. Large home review. So with this new process, what's equally important is what is the Planning Commission looking at when these projects are triggered? What is the Planning Commission thinking about considering as part of their decision whether to approve or to disapprove a project? We're proposing right now these 5 findings would be what the Planning Commission would have to do. That the project is of high architectural quality, that the project is contextual and compatible with the building siting, orientation, massing, fenestration pattern, and scale of the surrounding neighborhood, its relationship to surrounding density, that the project, how does the project address family-friendly units, and the unit reconfigurations if applicable. So if there are 2 existing flats in a building and they're doing a major addition, we want to know what's happening to those 2 flats. The Planning Commission has expressed their desire to try to retain that type of housing as much as possible, and they see that type of kind of what's always been a little bit of that entry-level housing of flats is going away, and they really want to see some of that protected in some way. So we wanted to build in some sort of finding where that could be factored in on a really large renovation project. All right, last but not least, some additional details. So as we've really called out, there are 3 other buckets outside of FAR that we will need to deal with as part of this. One is non-complying units. This is one of the pieces that we're actually doing some data crunching on right now, is based on our proposed FARs, we want to know how many buildings exist in the city are going to be automatic non-complying, meaning over that number to start with. You know, are there tons of these huge homes that are just going to be in a state of non-compliance as soon as the rule gets adopted? And we want to get a number to a point where, you know, not every home in San Francisco is, you know, starts out as non-complying. So we're doing that data crunching right now, and we're hoping to be done with it in the next few weeks. But how do we deal with that? How do we deal with non-compliant buildings? Our proposal is to allow up to a 10% expansion of the existing unit, and that would be cumulative over a course of 5 years. For those of you that are familiar with the Corona Heights SUD, this is a much smaller allowance than what's currently allowed in the Corona Heights SUD. So we did definitely look at that SUD for some things, and this is a much more conservative approach than what was proposed in Corona Heights. As it relates to accessory dwelling units, we heard very loudly during our community outreach and our Planning Commission hearings that folks want to have enable the addition of accessory dwelling units and really facilitate accessory dwelling units being added above and beyond density, and wanted that to be something that was encouraged as part of this proposal. This too is something that we're still working on and trying to figure out with our other side of house folks who are working on accessory dwelling unit legislation in our department. We want to get aligned with them, but our idea is to allow some sort of additional square footage. Right now our proposal is 25% of the largest unit, or 750 square feet, but somewhat feels like an ancillary amount for an accessory dwelling unit, and that can be square footage above and beyond. It adds density, it achieves some of our other policy goals. And then last but not least, we are working in collaboration with some of our other sister agencies, specifically Department of Building Inspection, as well as on the issues of rent control, the rent board, to try to clean up and make more clear the rules as they relate to when existing rent controlled housing is lost through a large alteration. Right now, those parameters are a little squishy and no one can ever provide a very, very clear answer of, does this project eliminate these rent controlled units, yes or no? And we want to bring more clarity to those answers so that our decision makers know what they're dealing with and know what the ramifications of the projects they're approving are. So that in short, in a very consolidated snapshot, is our proposal. And I look forward to taking questions, I guess, when the other folks are done.
Yes.
presenting. Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll have our next.